today's video, I thought I would take you through my collection of Charles Dickens novels. So I have the complete works of Dickens, but I've decided to just select 5 of my favourite Charles Dickens novels. This collection was handed down to me from my father, and it was handed down to my father from his father. So they're very old, these books, and as a result they look a little worse for wear, and I apologise about that. So the first book that I would like to talk about is called The Pickwick Papers, which was written in 1837. This book is it's a sequence of loosely related stories that were first written for serialization before being combined together into a novel. This is a very funny novel, actually, and a lot of the jokes are still funny today. I had a quick look through it before starting this video, and it's still very funny. The protagonist is a man called Samuel Pickwick, who's a benevolent, wealthy older gentleman who's the founder and president of the Pickwick Club, which is a club that is somewhat aimless. The members of the club are known as Pickwickians, and they're encouraged to make journeys outside of London and into remote parts of the country before returning and then reporting on their findings to other members of the club. And you can imagine all the hijinks that they get up to as a result of that. It is funny. It's also very well illustrated, and I would encourage anyone who's thinking about reading this to make sure they pick up a copy that has the illustrations in it. Most do, because, well, really, it was because of the illustrations that the book got written. Now there's a whole long, complicated and actually quite tragic history about the illustrations in this novel. I must admit I don't recall the full details, but essentially there was a illustrator that began working on this with Dickens. I think he was called Robert Seymour, and he got in an argument with Dickens about who came up with the idea, and tragically Robert Seymour ended up committing suicide, and then they found a new illustrator, and that was the illustrator that Dickens stayed with for most of the rest of his career. But there's always this weird story about his first book and this first illustrator. Did he kill himself because Dickens stole his idea, or was he just a very upset man, and this was just the final straw, this argument with Dickens? It's not clear. I do know Seymour's wife, or his widow, blamed Dickens, but I also know that Dickens wrote a very clear and very direct preface in a later copy of the Pickwick Papers, stating that Robert Seymour had no, I can't remember the exact phrasing, but he was very specific. He said no word or sentence came from Robert Seymour, that the book was in effect entirely Dickens's creation. So there you are. I don't know who to believe. I feel terrible for Robert Seymour. Whatever caused him to do that must have been deeply distressing. Probably wasn't just one thing, to be honest. It's probably a multitude. And I feel bad for Dickens because he is just starting his career and he's being accused essentially of plagiarism. And that must have been quite upsetting too. So who was wrong, who was right, I don't know. But I do know The Pickwick Papers is a fantastic novel and a great one to start with if you're not familiar with Dickens. Next in my collection, I want to talk about Nicholas Nickleby. I'm going through these in chronological order, by the way. So Nicholas Nickleby was written in 1839, and the protagonist, surprise, surprise, is Nicholas Nickleby, who's left destitute after his father has died. He's got no money, and he approaches a wealthy relative, but he finds no help there, and long story short, he's left to fend for himself and journey through his life, meeting odd characters along the way. To a certain extent, the setup is not too dissimilar to Pickwick Papers now that I'm thinking about it. It's a similar method, you know. Dickens sets up his characters in such a way that they will be forced to interact with a whole host of other characters, and the protagonist will be forced to step out of his comfort zone and be somewhere quite alien and obscure to him. And so that's what happens here, and you've got some great classic Dickens characters. You've got Wackford Squeers, who's a horrible headmaster at a school for unwanted boys. You have Smike, who's a slow-witted orphan who's actually rescued by Nicholas Nickleby. And then you've got, of course, you have Mr. and Mrs. Crummles and their daughter, who are just larger than life and mad. But there's a serious message behind the novel. As with most of Dickens's work, there's not so much with the first novel, but here there is a serious message about what it means to be, well, I suppose what class means, what it means to be privileged, what it means to be a gentleman at that time. Dickens seemed to be quite outraged by a social injustice, I suppose. And then next in the collection, my next favourite is David Copperfield, which is no surprise really. Everyone likes David Copperfield if they like Dickens. This was written in 1850, so it's quite a leap there, quite a jump from 1839 to 1850, so there's a significant shift in style, I suppose. It feels different, it feels more mature than his earlier works. His earlier works felt, in a way, a little bit scrappy to me, a little bit cobbled together still. Part of that is to do with the way in which they were written, which was, they were serialised for periodicals, so that's always going to contribute. But he hadn't smoothed over those transitions yet in a way that he did with David Copperfield. If you don't know the story, it's a coming-of-age story about David Copperfield, who starts his life impoverished, but slowly discovers his calling as a novelist. And again, the characters here are just iconic. You've got Mr. Murdstone, who his horrible stepfather, tyrannical, nasty, evil man, but also like a clown because he's so horrible. You can't take him seriously, really. He's just he's an idiot bully. Then you have people like Uriah Heep, who's another, possibly, this is my opinion, but possibly the greatest Dickens villain, because he's so slimy and full of crap. Basically, he's not a nice man, but he insists how nice he is. He's the character that says he's ever so humble. He's always insisting how humble he is, but of course he's not, because in the background he's always stealing and cheating and lying and putting himself first. He's a great character. He gives me the creeps. I really like him. And then the complete opposite of that, you have Mr. Micawber, who I think is up there with Falstaff in terms of great literary comedic characters. He's so funny, and the warmth that you get from him is fantastic, and it completely offsets the coldness of Uriah Heep. Just his endless optimism is almost childlike. It's very amusing. So yes, that's a great novel, and of course, as most of you probably know, it's based on Dickens' own life. A lot of it is quite autobiographical, and it was Dickens' favourite of his own novels. He called it his favourite child, which is rather sweet. Next is my favourite Dickens novel of all time, which is Bleak House. This was written in 1853, so not long after David Copperfield. And, this is a really special novel because this is when Dickens, for the first time, starts to actually play with the form of the novel. And by that I mean there are two main protagonists in the book. Two stories we follow. That of Lady Dedlock, who's she's a wealthy aristocrat, essentially. And we also follow Esther Summerson, and Esther Summerson, who's a poor, nobody, really. Turns out she is somebody, of course, but to begin with, she's just an orphan, with no money. But the reason why this book is interesting, particularly for its time, is because Dickens tells the story of Lady Dedlock from the third-person perspective, but he tells the story of Esther Summerson from the first-person perspective. So it's really quite almost modernist in that regard. No one else, to my knowledge, was doing this who had such a large platform. So that was quite daring of Dickens, and I think I've read that he struggled with that because it was so unusual. He struggled to enjoy doing that. But I think it was very effective because Lady Dedlock is, a very cold character, so you're going to want to be quite detached from her. You're going to want that third-person perspective, but Esther Summerson is the real hero, and you want to be close to her. And using these two perspectives and bouncing them off one another is really very clever, but more than clever. Clever's one thing, okay, fine, you're being clever, la-di-da. But it's when it's effective, narratively speaking, that's when you've got to say, okay, this is impressive. So, really great book, and the opening of Bleak House to this day just blows me away. It's so memorable, so memorable. It stays with you. It really conjures up such a solid, firm image of what he's trying to express. So excellent, superb, and then of course behind that you've got this ridiculous dispute around the Jarndyce and Jarndyce case, which was a wonderful satire of inspired by a real court case that dragged on for years and years and years, 50 years I think. And Dickens that was a great opportunity for Dickens to draw on his own experience as a law clerk. You could weave that in, and the whole novel is just a masterpiece. Oh, and also, before I move on to the next book, this is the beginning, you could argue, of the detective novel, because you have Mr. Bucket, Inspector Bucket, and the elements that we would go on to consider crucial for a detective novel are part of a subplot within Bleak House, focusing around Inspector Bucket. So that's quite interesting, and I think there are some critics and academics who have written about how you could consider Bleak House to be the first detective novel because of Inspector Bucket. Not sure I agree with that, but it's a really interesting stance to take, and I understand where they're coming from. So yeah, it's a fantastic novel, and definitely worth reading today. And then finally we have Little Dorrit. This was written in 1857, and it's a novel that satirises the shortcomings of both government and society, including debtors' prisons and where debtors were imprisoned. So you would be in debt, and so you'd be sent to prison, but then you weren't able to work while you were in prison, so you were unable to repay your debts that you're in prison for. And Dickens, like any normal person, thought that was completely unfair and utterly absurd, and so he satirised it in Little Dorrit to great effect. Also satirised bureaucracy with the Circumlocution Office, the inefficiency of bureaucratic nonsense. And I think it's I flicked through it before this video, and it's chapter 10 where he starts talking about the Circumlocution Office for the first time. That's very funny. I encourage, if you don't read any of Little Dorrit, at least read chapter 10, because it's probably one of the greatest satires I've ever written about bureaucracy, I would say, and still so relevant to today. I can't tell you how many times in life I've had to deal with a Circumlocution Office type situation. So this isn't dated in that regard. Surprisingly modern. Anyway, that was just a brief rundown of my favourite Dickens books from my collection. I hope you found it relaxing and interesting, and I hope it inspires you to read some Dickens. Thank you very much for listening.